Hi everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Earth Live lesson. Today's Earth Live lesson has been taken by me. I'm Tom Cameron. I'm from the University of Essex, and I'm an animal ecologist. Really pleased to be here with you this afternoon. I'm going to be talking in the main today about shellfish, about oysters, and oyster that's native to the UK, the native European oyster. But before that, I want to tell you a little bit about my background. So, as I said, I am an animal ecologist, and at least that means when I started off my journey, I was only going to work on animals. I didn't want to work on any of those plant things, but that's changed a little bit since then. My main love of the natural world is understanding how animal populations respond to change. So, for example, how they respond to climate change. But most of my career has been spent trying to understand how animal populations respond to mortality from predators, and including when those predators are you and I. So, for example, how they respond to fishing or hunting or some other form of exploitation, which is quite a common way that we interact with the natural world. So sometimes it is about climate, for example, how at the moment a lot of the people in work with me were trying to understand how animal populations respond to summer warming, climate warming. It could be how they respond to a new food being available to them. So if a new species moves into their range in response to climate change, species move north. So that could be a new food source for a predator. How does that predator population respond to that? I'm interested in that. Or it could be that a species moves in that it's a new competitor, and we want to understand how this new competitor might influence another animal population. But by and large, it's looking at how populations respond to other predators or mortality. And most of my research has been doing that experimentally over the years. And how I got here is very strange. It's a very strange journey. I'm not particularly academic. I didn't never got a first at university, and I never got those top grades at school. But I've always loved the natural world, and I've always loved working outdoors. And those two things is basically why I got to where I am now. I'm now what's known as a senior lecturer in the UK, or an associate professor in many other parts of the world. And I got here just because I didn't stop. Not because I'm particularly clever, but because I didn't stop and I didn't give up. And I kept doing exactly what I loved doing and knocking on doors, many doors, and many closed, but every now and then one of them stayed open. And that little bit of perseverance helped me get to do the job I love, which is working in the natural world and working with animal population ecology. And it's taken me in many places in the UK, from the north of Scotland to way down here in the warm tropical climate of Essex in the south of England. Certainly tropical from a cold-blooded Scotsman that's from the north of the United Kingdom. But also in Europe, I've worked in Sweden, and I've worked this job that I love, studying animals in the natural environment, mainly the aquatic environment, has taken me far over for what's for me traveling west over to Alaska to study fishes in thermal streams, and also traveling just as far, if not further east, to Kamchatka in the far east of Russia to study salmonids in these volcanic thermal streams, and understanding how those fish might respond to future stream temperatures by thinking about, well, those fish in those volcanic streams must be already dealing with warming worlds. And so it's a brilliant job to be able to do. It's something I fully recommend if you love the natural world and love working outdoors, that you try and get into. So that's a bit of a background about me and some of the adventures that I've been able to do. And we're going to move now on to thinking about the aquatic world. But it's not always been fish and shellfish that I've worked on. In fact, that's quite a recent part of my career, working on shellfish and working on fishes. The journey taxonomically has been diverse as well. So I actually started off with many people, a love of birds. I've been part of Team Bird, and I've really loved working on wild birds. I've grouse and plovers, and understanding how land management interacts with nesting success of some of these birds. And I've also worked on many animal invertebrates, both in the wild setting, because they're often the food for birds and fish, but not just because of that, because they're great model systems and experimental systems. And it's only recently, in the last few years, that knocking on doors has allowed me to switch over to working on wild fishes and thinking about both marine fishes and freshwater fishes and shellfishes as a resource that we can manage well. We're not always doing a good job of it, but we can get there and manage it well so that it has a wild natural system, but also provides some benefit to you and I as a food, and as one of the organisms that provides us lots of benefits in the natural world, what we call ecosystem services, because of the functions they perform, and we'll talk about soon. So we're going to talk about oysters, and you may know lots of other shellfish. My main focus today will be on oysters, and you know lots of different shellfish from the marine world, usually things that you've eaten or you know people that eat them, like mussels and scallops and cockles. But there's also freshwater shellfish, lots of freshwater mussels around the world. In fact, a huge diverse group that in some places are not doing particularly well. But you can hear about them, and they're very exciting animals, our shellfish. And I'm interested in them for lots of reasons. One is their conservation value and the things that they do, and the economic and societal value, so the money and the jobs and the food that they can provide. But also because they can provide some services to other species on this planet that helps us retain biodiversity, and we'll talk about that a bit. And the oysters that we're interested in the main, that I'm going to talk about, are oysters that live in coastal habitats, so shallow coastal habitats. And coastal habitats are very, very important. They're the main part of the sea that we all interact with. So that's a real positive thing. It's the thing when we walk over the sand dune and we see the sea emerge that really fills us with joy. The coastal shallow water habitats are where it provides food and nourishment and a kind of mindfulness for many different people across the entire planet. But the downside of that means that it's also the part of the environment in the sea that we most commonly interact with, which means it's the part of the ocean that we're having some of the strongest negative effects on, certainly have in the past and continuing to present. It is easy to think of why that is, because we depend on the coastal environment for access for fishing, for shipping, for transport. We have depended on it for many, many years for putting our waste into the rivers and down and out to the sea, even taking waste out, and something we don't do now, just dumping it at sea. But we've done that for a very long time. That has a negative effect on the ocean. And exploitation of those shellfish and foods that we like to eat in the ocean sometimes has gone too far. And that's another, and probably one of the main reasons that some of the animals that we might want to be in the ocean, some of those shellfish that can be valuable to us, have declined. If you look at aquatic habits in general, I advise you to go and look at Google Earth and look at the least populated parts of the world, some of those parts of the world that are not very populated. So the very North Boreal Forest or the North Arctic in the tundra, and look at it on Google Earth and look at all the water that's there. Look at how many ponds and marshlands and wetlands are there, because there's nobody there. But if you look at in the southern latitudes, even though there would probably be less lakes and ponds and wet marshlands there anyway, you will see that most of that land is now industrialized, perhaps industrial farmland, perhaps urban industry. And that's kind of a signature of the effects that we have had. And I'm not saying this to be too doom and gloom, but on this planet, we like to retain land, usually not such a wet form, so that we can use it. So we've done a lot of draining, and we've done a lot of removing wetlands back into farmlands or lands that we can build on. And much of the planet has been modified in that way. And so if we look across all parts of the world, it doesn't matter where you look or what nations you think of, we've all done a lot of changing inland and coastal habitats away from what they used to be into something that we can use. So if you just think about Europe in general, since about 1700s, we've lost between, estimates vary, but between 57 and 85% of wetlands all over. And whether we look at freshwater inland wetlands or coastal wetlands, it's about an average of about 1% of our wetlands per annum since that time. And that was a very long time ago. So if you add that 1% up, it soon adds up to quite, kind of upsetting figure of wetland loss. And it's why freshwater and brackish coastal water habitats are one of, if not the most, imperiled habitats in the world. And certainly freshwater and coastal habitat biodiversity has had some of the strongest declines of any other set group of animal organisms and plant organisms from across the planet. But I'm hoping that that is not where it ends. It's not the doom and gloom, because these habitats are really important, and we see a massive interest, a huge revival and interest to restore these habitats back to what they once were. And I'm going to focus on the coastal part of the wetlands, both in estuaries and the surrounding habitats, where we're seeing a big uplift in Europe, North America, and many other places to get these habitats back functioning to the way they once were, particularly in the three S's: the salt marshes, the seagrasses, and the shellfish. So we can see lots of effort to develop methods to upscale salt marsh restoration, those lovely spongy sea defense habitats that provide lots of functional roles, like protecting us from the rising sea levels, but also lots of biodiversity. To get our seagrasses back that have been lost through disease and pollution and over dredging and damaging of habitats, there's big pushes globally to get them back, both in North America, Europe, and elsewhere. And now shellfish. Shellfish restoration outside of Europe is already really quite far ahead, and we're kind of really catching up, especially with native species. And there is a good link between aquaculture and the restoration of shellfish, and we'll touch on that. But really, Europe's just beginning to take off now, and it's very exciting. Got some questions coming in. Is the fishing industry controlling harvesting of shellfish? Yes and no, and I'll come to that a bit. There's a bit of a difference between the wild fishing and the aquaculture, but I will try and address that. I hope, Mike, I address that properly later. Okay, so coastal habitats. Most of you will probably think of coastal habitats. You like going to the beach when it's nice and sandy. And sandy beaches are lovely. I really do like them. I do have an affinity for them myself. But most of the really important coastal wetland habitats are not so sandy. They're actually very muddy. They're mud, that gloopy mud, that smelly mud that you see in estuary. It's not very nice to stand in and not very nice to swim in. But it's really, really important, these estuarine habitats. Important for lots of different reasons. Most people from Team Bird will say it's important because it provides the food for lots and lots of birds in winter, wherever you are in the world. You have estuaries that are probably heavily used, more so in winter than they are in summer, as either stopover or main winter foraging habitats for birds. But also that means that there's lots of good biodiversity and lots of good food webs happening in those estuaries in their own right. But some of the other functions in those estuaries are vitally important, and losing just an acre of it can help us lose some of those functions. It helps regulate the nutrient cycles, the microbes in the mud, help clean the water that's coming off the land, and it helps produce all sorts of interesting gases that are required for the planet to regulate itself. So mud on an estuary and the function of an estuary is really, really important. The more complex the estuary, the more biodiversity it can hold, the more range of habitats it can hold, and the better it is for us. For regulating services, for regulating carbon trapping, and for cleaning all pollutants that come off land, like nitrogen, phosphates, etc., etc. And one of those complex habitats that should be in estuaries are rich shellfish communities, either shellfish that live under the mud, like the clams and the cockles that live deep down in the mud that people have to kind of catch at low tide, or from the bed forming and the reef forming shellfish like oysters and mussels that provide really interesting complex habitats in their own right, but then other species can utilize, and it helps maintain biodiversity and allows biodiversity to recover. So I want to talk now then about some of these shellfish in these estuaries that that we can have reef forming and bed forming. So reef forming on the mud and on the side of the estuary, or bed forming in the deeper water and the subtidal parts of estuaries. And in Europe and in the UK is what I'm going to talk about now. We have a number of different oysters, but only one of them is native. And we have the rock oyster, which is now a species that's global for aquaculture. It was thought that it could only be kept in aquaculture. It would never escape into the wild. The temperature in Britain would never get warm enough to allow it to spawn. But of course, in most places of the world, because of climate change, that's changed. So we now have that rock oyster that lives here. And then we'll have the native oyster. And the native oyster is very different to a rock oyster. Many of you will know what rock oysters look like. This is an old shell from a native oyster. Shape-wise, it looks very much like a scallop. And if you look closely at the side of the shell, it's kind of got these flaky layers on it. It's not sharp. It's not very sharp and stony, or it's not got no razor bits on it that you find on a rock oyster. And when you see it on the bed, it's like a big, wide kind of circle, almost circular animal. This animal's probably quite old when it died, maybe 17 years old. It's much slower growing than the rock oysters that we get in the warm intertidal. And it can grow in the intertidal, on the lower intertidal, but it's found mainly in subtidal habitats. And it's found naturally over a huge range. Species that are known as the European oyster, Ostrea edulis, can be found from down in the Mediterranean, from a natural recruitment in the Mediterranean, away up into Scandinavia and Europe. So it covers a very broad range of water temperatures. It lives for maybe 22 years, maybe more, but we're not sure. But certainly it's quite a long-lived shellfish. And as I say, it's quite slow growing. And it's this oyster that I'm interested in speaking about today and talking about the restoration. So rock oysters were still welcome for aquaculture. We're really positive about rock oysters in their own place, but it is a little bit tricky for some for conservation, because we want to maintain rock oysters in aquaculture, but we want to ecologically restore the native oyster to its former range. And of course, this animal used to be really important, because before we had the rock oyster, we had millions and millions and millions and millions of these. Before we had the need to start using rock oysters, before we had the decline of the native oyster, they were a very common animal, and people ate lots of them, lots and lots of them. And now we don't even know about it. Most people don't even know about these. But we used to line the streets of London and Edinburgh and other cities across Europe and devour these on street corners. So we've lost a lot of our oysters. In fact, depending on which way you look at it, by number or by area, we've lost more than 80% of the native oysters that existed in Europe, and that applies no matter where you look in Europe. But there are strongholds remaining, and a lot of those strongholds are got to do with oystermen who have been fishing them for generations, and their fathers before them, and that interest has probably kept some of that species in the area. And I'll come back to that in a while. But Essex is certainly known as one of the strongholds. There are several in the UK and several in Europe where there's still stocks, and you can go. We'll tell you where to go online and find out about them. But Essex is a stronghold, and we did some work, in fact, led by the Essex Wildlife Trust here in the southern North Sea, that discovered that we had one of the really important strongholds. And in fact, we submitted that data to the government, and they made one of the largest inshore marine conservation zones in the UK. But not only that, for the native oyster, a 284 kilometre squared marine conservation that now exists here in Essex, just outside my house, and across here is the River Colne, which is the start of the MCZ, and it's 284 square kilometres, covering the Colne and the Blackwater and the Crouch and Roach estuaries, to protect and restore the native oyster to its former glory. And we already have quite a few, and the stronghold results in several millions of animals still being here, which is really exciting. There's very few places that we can say we have that many of these animals still living here in the bottom of the estuaries. But it's still, as exciting as it is, it's still a fracture of the former. The companies we work with, the older companies that have been here for many hundreds of years, and the oystermen and the traditions that have been here for many hundreds of years, working with native oysters in the wild tell us that their abundance used to be much, much higher. And they've suffered for a variety of reasons. It's not just fishing. A lot of it's to do with pollution and disease. So pollution that's outside the hands of the oystermen that work with them, and from industry, from boat paints, from coming off of land, from us, from the rivers that we used to put our waste into, as you know, it can cause a lot of issues. So we have had a number of different effects that have led to them declining. So we do have, what do we have and why is important? Well, they do a lot of different things other than just being good to eat. They provide lots of biodiversity. They filter the water for us, and it provides those lost ecosystems that we need to get back. So why do they provide biodiversity? Well, let's have a look at some shells that I've stuck together. As soon as you look at one shell, it looks like, how can any other animals live in that? But if you look at several shells, you can see they all stick together. And the more that those oysters build up together, they provide lots and lots of little holes that other animals can live in. And we've already discovered from work that we've done in the estuary that the more we do for native oysters, the more native oysters that we have, the more biodiversity we can get back. In fact, if we could recover native oysters to a density of about 5 to 10 per meter squared, we could get 60% more biodiversity back. So that's something that's really positive. And then what about the filtering? Well, I've put a video for you up on the extra information. Have a click at that. You can see that oysters are able to filter somewhere between 120, 135 litres of water per day. There's lots of different estimates for different species. But even at that, if you take that per oyster value and you multiply it by the millions of oysters we have, or the millions we could have, we could get that cleaner water back to, you know, maybe these oysters, it's hypothetical, but these oysters could well be a means to clean and improve the water quality. And maybe that's why water quality has declined in some places, because the filtering capacity of prolific shellfish populations has declined. If we get them back, we could get that clean water back again. And those lost ecosystems of, you know, getting some biodiversity back, supporting biodiversity, supporting local fisheries in the future, and supporting the aquaculture link that Mike asked about, such that if there are thriving wild populations of native oysters, even just using a small amount of them each year will allow aquaculture companies to develop that stock to make it suitable for human consumption. And we don't just have to rely on wild exploitation of the wild stock. We'll have a good relationship between the recovered wild stock and a healthy aquaculture business on native oysters, and not just the success of the aquaculture and the rock oyster. So I just encourage you to start thinking about native oysters wherever you live, because there's lots of oysters around the world that have been in decline that people are trying to recover. Get involved with some of the oyster restoration programs. Here in Europe, it's NORA, N-O-R-A, or in the UK, the Native Oyster Network. You can find us online. And our project, Essex Oyster, you can find us on Twitter, and there's some links below. And I'll stay online for a second. And if you've got any further questions, I'm really happy to answer them. Remember that there is a Earth Live session on again tomorrow and subsequent days. So I'm here for you if you have any questions. So a question come in from Emily: what interested me in oysters in the first place? Well, in one way, nothing. I didn't know anything about oysters, but I met someone in a train station car park that had the words Fisheries and Conservation on the side of their van. And I knocked on the door and I said, "Hi, my name's Tom. I'm a new animal ecologist living in Essex. I've just joined a local university. I'm interested in what you work on. What could we do together?" And here I am, 6 years later now, heavily involved in a big restoration project. So it's fascinating just how important it is just to knock on a door sometimes and see where it takes you. Because now we're doing some really exciting work, and it's only happening because I knocked on a door. It's a good question, Emily. Another question from Emily that came in earlier: in areas with declining numbers of oysters, what is the impact on the environment? Well, it's difficult to say because there's many different factors that affect the environment. Affecting the things that kill off oysters or led to, you know, oysters declining may have also affected other things. So they weren't kind of, you know, necessarily mutually exclusive or independent. But certainly recovering the oysters in those areas that have retained oysters have found that biodiversity can be higher. Now, more biodiversity isn't always better. It's the type of biodiversity. So sometimes the right biodiversity is best, and so higher isn't always better. But certainly we know that taking into account that it's confounded a little bit by lots of non-native species moving around the coastal parts of the world, oyster habitats do support more biodiversity than the alternatives, which tends to be kind of rather muds and sands, because there's very little else that will live on top of the muds and sands other than shellfish beds. A good question that came in: how can we protect people? How can we get people inspired about oysters? Well, I'm hoping that talking about them and accepting that, yes, these are an animal that we sometimes eat as food, but it's not the only thing that we do. We have lots of other things that we can benefit from these animals, and we should have them back and not worry about protecting species and doing conservation for a species that could be food. I know that's very controversial. It becomes controversial when we talk about let's take a controversial conservation topic like trophy hunting in Africa. It's very controversial, but people will argue that interest protects the species. Well, fishing an oyster isn't that different. It's saying that getting this species back and conserving it is important. And fishing and food consumption is as important a driver to use as a conservationist, like a tool in your toolbox, to get people interested. And I have, my experience is that the champions of this species locally and, across the Europe that we're working in, a lot of the champions of this species are the families and the companies that are involved in protecting it and restoring it as an economic resource that they then sell for food. So we have many millions, but they sell very few. So it can sometimes be controversial, but we should be inspired about maybe kind of restoring the interest in oysters as a consumption, which is something that most people won't eat, but they're quite nice. Any other questions coming in? Hello from Brighton. Hi, I see Brighton online. No, I haven't got any other questions, but if that's us for questions, then I'll probably overshot my time already. Remember, there's Earth Live lessons again tomorrow. If you want to know anything about native oyster restoration in Europe or beyond, get in touch with Nora, the Native Oyster Network, or myself at Essex University, or Essex Oyster Online on Twitter. Bye now.